Good morning and welcome to our Living Sickle Smart session. We are so excited to come to you today, and we are excited to share about why Black blood matters. And so our Living Sickle Smart series is a series that we've been doing since September. We've had several different guest speakers that have come to us to discuss several things, everything from sickle cell disease, a public health emergency, to disease modifying treatments and curative therapies. In November and December, we have some exciting sessions for you that are planned. You can view each of the sessions either on our website or YouTube channel. If you go to our website, it's going to take you to our YouTube channel anyway. So, however, you can view it through either platform. You can also stay abreast of other events that we have coming up and accessing those events through our Eventbrite channel to see all of our events. And then lastly, we want to make sure that you know that as we continue with our sessions, we've had the role of bone and blood and bone marrow in therapies for sickle cell disease. We have a video up with Be the Match, who talked to us about bone marrow transplant, as well as the need for Black and brown people, more diversity in the bone marrow registry. Today, we are talking about diversifying the blood donor pool and why Black blood matters. And we are so thrilled to have with us Dr. David C. Mair. And he is the Divisional Chief Medical Officer at the American Red Cross. And without further ado, I am going to turn it over to him. I'm going to stop sharing. But before I do, I want to make sure that I say thank you to all of our sponsors. And to remind you that next week we will have a curative therapy option in sickle cell disease, Fixing the Bend, with Dr. Ashish Gupta, who is the pediatric blood and marrow transplant physician at the University of Minnesota. That is next Wednesday, October 27th at 12:30 p.m. We hope that you can join us. That too will be a live webinar. All right. So again, thank you to our sponsors, Be the Match, the Red Cross, and Bluebird Bio. I'm going to stop sharing now. And Dr. Mair, I'm going to turn it over to you to share the screen. Yes, we know that Dr. Mair is sideways right now, but his slides won't be. So we are going to go with the flow. All right. All right. Dr. Mair, you can unmute. I'm going to mute and turn my camera off so all the attention is on you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm sideways Dr. David Mair, so I'm going to start sharing my slides. Right. All right, hopefully you all can see my first slide, right? Can everybody see it?
I sure can.
Fantastic, and hopefully it's not sideways. So, and again, good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. David Mair. I'm one of the Divisional Chief Medical Officers within the Red Cross. I also attend at the University of Minnesota in their blood bank and on their therapeutic apheresis service, and I'll be talking about that a little bit this morning as well, and also cover the Minneapolis VA hospital. But what Ms. Blaylock has asked me to talk to you about this morning is closing the sickle cell gap, the American Red Cross's initiative to promote a diverse blood donor base and meet the needs of patients with sickle cell disease. So what I'm going to cover this morning, I'm going to give you some background. Ms. Blaylock asked me to talk a little bit about the history of the Red Cross. So I'm going to do that briefly. And then we'll go into what is sickle cell disease and why we need a diverse blood donor pool. I'll then move on to what ARC is doing to increase diversity in the donor base and also together with that, talk about how you can help in diversifying the blood donor base as well. So let's start off with some background on the American Red Cross. Just briefly, the American Red Cross, as many of you may know, was founded in 1881 by the nursing pioneer, Clara Barton. The American Red Cross founded initially to provide assistance for Americans suffering from disasters or serving in the battlefield. And Ms. Barton served as our organization's president until 1904. Jumping ahead, and I apologize, this was a little sharper earlier today, but we'll go with it. Jumping ahead from the early 1900s to around World War II, when our blood program began. In 1940, the US established a national blood program, and it mainly focused on blood for Britain. We hadn't yet gotten involved in World War II, and there was an early blood processing program for relief of English war victims called Plasma for Britain, and that was put under the direction of an African-American surgeon by the name of Dr. Charles Drew. Then in 1941, as things started to rev up and American involvement for the war started to increase, the Red Cross began a national blood donor service for the military and made Dr. Charles Drew, the former head of the Plasma for Britain program, our first Red Cross medical director. After the war, we transitioned to a civilian program, with starting our first nationwide program in 1948, starting up in Rochester, New York. And then in 1949, things expanded even further. And by 1949, the United States blood system was comprised of 1,500 hospital blood banks and 46 community blood centers and 31 American Red Cross regional blood centers. And jumping forward to today, the American Red Cross is the largest nonprofit blood system in the US, meeting the needs of over 40% of our nation's blood supply. We have some 2,500 hospitals across the country, approximately, that we serve. All right, that was the background. Let's talk about what is sickle cell disease. And I hope you all will have some questions about this as I go through both this and the need for a diverse blood donor pool at the end of my talk today. So what is sickle cell disease? It's a genetic disease, the most common one in the United States, that, of course, by hence the name, affects the shape and lifespan of red blood cells. And in this illustration on the right, you can see a normal shaped red blood cell, and of course, a sickled red blood cell. It contains an abnormal hemoglobin that is formed due to the genetics of the individual with sickle cell disease. And that abnormal shape, unfortunately, can block the bloodstream, so that once the cells deliver their oxygen, they form that sickle shape. They cannot flow through the bloodstream easily, and they can cause blockages and prevent other red cells from delivering oxygen to your tissues and organs, which unfortunately for these patients with sickle cell disease results in organ damage, tissue damage, and severe pain crises due to these blockages from the sickle cells. And one of our leading treatments, of course, for this is to transfuse these patients with red blood cells from normal individuals who with hemoglobin A, and I'll talk about that normal hemoglobin, to replace their sickle cells to help deliver oxygen to the tissues and prevent further organ damage. Just to illustrate that in more detail, again, this is the normal gene structure that forms hemoglobin A, which is normal hemoglobin, and this is the genetic mutation, the switch here in the DNA that causes the hemoglobin S to form, the abnormal hemoglobin that causes sickle cell disease. So when those sickle cells with the abnormal hemoglobin S deliver their oxygen, They again can form this sickle shape. And what is shown here, if you can see my arrow, here is these cells forming, getting into the sickle shape and causing a blockage that prevents delivery of further oxygen to the organs and tissues that are further downstream of that blockage. And that causes organ damage and shortens the lifespan, unfortunately, of patients with this condition. What are some of the complications of sickle cell disease? Well, the first symptoms usually appear in infancy, and it affects multiple organs. Just to highlight some, it causes organ damage to the kidneys, and these people can suffer from kidney failure. It causes painful crises in their bones due to these blockages that can be very, very painful, and again need to be corrected with a transfusion of normal hemoglobin. They can have damage to their very distal extremities, such as their toes and their fingers, as shown here. These patients will lose their spleen early on in life, which puts them at higher risk for infections as part of the blockages that the sickle cell causes. And acutely, in the middle of the night, I may have to come in to treat a patient who has suffered a stroke due to these blockages, or pulmonary lung damage due to these blockages. That pulmonary crisis is also called acute chest syndrome. And strokes and the pulmonary crises very often need to be treated emergently, and we have to come in the middle of the night and find match units for those patients as quickly as possible to potentially save their lives. Again, some of the symptoms start in infancy. Up to 60% of these patients have at least one of these severe pain crises per year. And again, these blockages results in the organ damage that I mentioned here. And in particular, in the middle of the night, it could be this chest syndrome or a stroke. A little bit about the inheritance of it. Again, sickle cell is the most common inherited blood disease in the US. It affects some 100,000 Americans, over 100,000 Americans. Sickle cell trait, which is just carrying one copy of the gene, and I'll talk about that in a second, is found in 8% of African Americans. Again, this is a condition that affects primarily African Americans. Sickle cell disease affects about 1 out of every 365 Black or African American births, but also about 1 out of every 16,000 approximately Hispanic American births. And what do I mean by the trait versus the disease? So the trait means the person's just a carrier for the abnormal hemoglobin and does not have the disease. And I'll talk about that here. In this illustration here, we have a father and a mother who have 2 copies. Everybody has 2 copies of every gene. And for this father who has sickle cell trait, not the disease, these individuals usually are completely healthy, has 1 copy of the normal hemoglobin A, and the other chromosome has a copy for the sickle gene, the abnormal hemoglobin. And same thing with mom in this scenario. So because each child, all of us inherit 1 gene from each of our parents, they will have a quarter of their children will inherit 2 copies of the normal hemoglobin gene and be completely healthy. There are 2 more of their children will be trait, so half their children will be trait positive like them, where they have 1 normal copy and 1 abnormal copy. But 1 in 4 of their children, 25% of their children, will have 2 copies of the disease and of the gene and be at risk for the disease with all the complications that I talked about. And this is one of the reasons Red Cross, as part of our initiative, is providing sickle trait testing. People that declare their ethnicity as African American, because it's important health information for people to have and be aware of. But this is how the disease is transmitted potentially through the gene system. And what are the treatments for sickle cell disease? Well, right now, the only real cure for sickle cell disease is a bone marrow transplant. But as Ms. Blaylock said early on in the presentation, we don't have enough bone marrow donors, and I apologize for my text sound. I'm going to shut that off. We don't have enough bone marrow donors to meet the demand for bone marrow transplant. That's part of the problem. The other problem is that because of the organ damage I talked about, a lot of sickle cell disease patients are not healthy enough to tolerate a transplant. So the availability of bone marrow transplant for these individuals is currently pretty limited. There are some other promising gene therapies that are in the research stage. They look very promising, but they still are the research stage and are not readily available either. So today, it's really transfusion that we're using to keep these patients alive and comfortable and improve their lifespan. That transfusion can be just a simple transfusion where you infuse a unit or two, but for many patients, what we prefer to do, especially in the middle of the night, is a red cell exchange, where we're removing the unhealthy red cells with the abnormal hemoglobin S and replacing it with healthy hemoglobin versus just topping off the person with more healthy hemoglobin, but leaving their unhealthy hemoglobin in them with a simple transfusion. When we're doing an exchange, and this is a machine that we use to do these exchanges at the University of Minnesota, when we do these exchanges for a person the size of this individual that's in the picture here, we may need at least 5 units or 10 or more, depending on the size of the individual. Pediatric patients, of course, being smaller, would need less. And again, we need to find this blood very often emergently in the middle of the night, as I talked about. Also, prophylactically, these patients need a transfusion or red cell exchange to prevent stroke. And thus, these patients can require anywhere from 36 to over 120 units of transfusion a year to stay healthy and alive. And I just want to highlight that for you all. So keep that in mind as we go on with this talk about this 120 plus units that some patients may need every year to survive. All right, so that's the background on what is sickle cell disease. And again, I hope you all will have questions at the end. Let's talk about the need for a diverse blood donor pool to meet the transfusion needs of this patient population. So why we need more African-American blood donors? Okay, why we need more African-American blood donors is many of you participating in the talk today may know your blood type. You may be A positive, B negative, O positive, what have you. And for your average transfusion, if you're just coming in for a couple of units, for your routine transfusion, that's all you need to know is whether you're A, B neg or O positive. That's all that matters. But sickle cell disease is not just your typical transfusion scenario. For certain patients that need transfusions chronically, they need them for their entire lives potentially. This ongoing red cell replacement, like can occur in sickle cell disease, transfusions become more complicated than just being O positive or B negative. There are other substances on red cells, besides the A substance and the B substance, et cetera, on red cells that don't matter for just your average regular transfusion typically. But for chronically transfused patients, for a chronic transfusion-dependent illness like sickle cell disease, these other substances begin to matter. And these other substances, just to name a few of the common ones, there's a Kell substance, a Duffy substance, there's a Kidd substance. There's hundreds of these other substances on red cells that, again, don't matter for your typical transfusion, but do matter for chronically transfused patients like our sickle cell disease population. And matching for these other substances on red cells is in many ways analogous to finding a bone marrow match. It's much more difficult to find a match for red cells for all those other substances in addition to A and B or O. And like with a bone marrow match, you're more likely to find a perfect red cell match within similar ethnic groups. Just like in the bone marrow setting, you're more likely to find that bone marrow match if you're Japanese American, you're more likely to find that from somebody that's of Japanese ancestry. Same thing here for these red cell matches. For African Americans, you're more likely, not that Caucasians can't provide blood for sickle cell disease patients, they can, but we're more likely to find it faster and quicker, especially in those middle of the night scenarios, if we're starting with donors who are more likely to be a match, hence African American donors. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the differences in these substances. In this table here, on the far left-hand column, I've listed some of these common substances, other red cell substances that come into play. And then in the second column, that's what we'll focus on, is the donor base. The majority of our donor base, because the majority of our population is Caucasian American. And these are the percentages of Caucasian Americans, and I've highlighted the ones in orange in particular because they're some of the ones that we begin to have problems finding a match for. So what in this first column is what the percentages of these substances are found on red cells for European Americans, and that is the majority of the blood supply. And then we have the percentage of African Americans, which is our patient population for sickle cell disease, and the percentage of African Americans that have those substances on their red cells. And just to highlight one in a little bit more detail, all of these are some differences. You can see, if I pick on the Duffy A substance, FYA, 66% of the donor base carries the Duffy substance, but only 10% of the patient population, the sickle cell disease population, carries the Duffy substance. And that's a mismatch between the blood we're using for those substances and the patient population we're treating. Again, this doesn't matter for your average transfusion, but in these chronic transfusion settings, these matter. Let's go into a little bit more detail, specifically on the Duffy substance, but keep in mind all of these other substances that I've highlighted in orange that also show some differences between the donor base and the patient population. All right, so let's say I'm giving you an example of a sickle cell disease patient that's receiving monthly transfusion support. And as we talked about, only 10% of African Americans are Duffy A positive. That means that 90% of African Americans are Duffy A negative, and sickle cell disease primarily affects African Americans. So 90% chance that this patient I'm giving you in this hypothetical scenario is going to lack the Duffy substance. But again, keep in mind, 66% of the donor base carries the Duffy substance. Our patient is Duffy negative, 2/3 of the blood supply is Duffy positive, and we also have to match for those other substances on that table, and this causes a mismatch for these patients between the blood we're able to provide and the blood that would best suit them for any chronic transfusion illness like this. So let me give you a scenario. So we have our chronically transfused patient. We have the majority of the blood supply is going to have the Duffy substance, but our patient lacks it. And we can transfuse this patient with Duffy A substance positive blood. We can do that several times. But then eventually, because we're giving blood that has the substance and this person lacks the substance, that person, we put them at risk for making an antibody against that substance. Eventually, the patient will recognize those red cell units as foreign because they carry the Duffy A substance, and they'll make an antibody against the Duffy A substance. And once they make that antibody, we can no longer give them that Duffy A positive blood. Because if we do that, that can cause that patient will reject that subsequent transfusion after they make the antibody. And what we could call there is a potentially fatal hemolytic transfusion reaction that can occur, which we want to absolutely prevent from happening. And hence why having Duffy A negative blood would be ideal, and we can get it faster and quicker if we have more African American donors. So 90% of African Americans, we are VA negative, are a better life-saving match for this patient. So hopefully you have a little better sense of why we need more African American donors. And I'm going to go into this in some more detail again still. But you see the need. Again, it's not that Caucasians can't be a match, just more likely and more rapidly we'll find it with a greater African Americans in our donor base. And having more African Americans, you can find that match blood for these patients in need of chronic transfusion therapy faster in emergencies. We sometimes have to delay in the emergency setting in the middle of the night because we're rapidly screening blood to match for all those other substances, not just VA, but all of them. So we could get that blood faster in emergencies. If we know we're screening an African American donor supply, we're more likely to find it and quicker than if we're doing with a Caucasian-based donor supply. And we'll have that blood ready and available more often for non-emergencies. All of this is to prevent patients from ultimately developing antibodies, becoming immunized to the transfusions and rejecting future transfusions, which could also be fatal, which we don't want to do. We want to prevent early death in these patients and not be the cause of it. Now, what are the challenges? Why do we have why do we need more African American donors? What are the challenges of getting more African American donors in the blood supply? Well, part of the reason the blood supply is represented the way it is because it's just a representation of our population. The majority of sickle cell disease patients are African American, but only 13% of our nation is African American. So that's a challenge right there, and that we just make up a lower percentage of the population. And then on top of that, to be honest, the blood collection industry, my industry, does not do great at recruiting minorities. And that's one of the things the Red Cross is working at. As you can see here, again, majority of the donor base is Caucasian, but African Americans and other minority groups, we just don't do as good a job of getting them in the door. And even though African Americans are 13% of the population, there are only 4% of the donor base. And that's on us. We need to do a better job of recruiting all minorities for blood donation. But I'll get into some of the challenges that the recruiting minority donors. Every community is diverse within itself, and with individuals at every economic level, and the African American community certainly reflects that and is not monolithic. And the challenges I'm going to talk about, some of them are not necessarily unique to just the African American community, but some are specific to the African American community, and I'll touch on that. And these are challenges that pose problems in recruiting African American donors, but also some provide challenges for other communities of color and other marginalized communities. What are some of those challenges? Well, first of all, lack of trust in the medical community, and blood collection agencies are seen as part of the medical community. Historical community trauma, poor treatment by authorities, medical mistreatment. We have the Tuskegee syphilis study, the Henrietta Lacks incident, segregation of the blood supply. Early on, around World War II, blood centers segregated the blood supply based on race because of local community requirements. But I will say this, the Red Cross was one of the first ones to cease and desist doing that. Clearly, Dr. Drew was against that segregation, and we were one of the first organizations to stop segregating the blood supply based on race. And overall, there's structural racism that leads to a lack of equitable access to healthcare in general, social, educational, and economic capital. And again, some of these aren't specific to just the African American community. They can be generalized to other communities, but some of these do directly impact the African American community. Other problem, this is on us, Donation sites aren't conveniently located in our communities as they could be. And again, recruitment of communities of color has not been a consistent focus by we, the blood collection organizations, and we need to do a better job of that. And actually, things have gotten a little worse with COVID. Again, as you showed on that slide earlier, we're 13% of the population, but we've seen a drop over 2 years from the 4% I showed you on that earlier slide to about 3% of our donor population being African American. And this only got worse during the pandemic. As you know, the pandemic disproportionately affected minority groups, including African Americans, and we saw it drop off even further. So we're facing even greater challenges meeting this patient need. So our initiative within the Red Cross is a 5-year initiative that we've committed a lot of resources to, and I'll talk about that, where our hope is to triple the amount of African American blood donations in that 5-year span. So now that we've done the background, let's talk about what the Red Cross is doing to increase diversity in the donor base and how you can help be part of that. One of the things the Red Cross is doing is we're focusing on community-based organizations. I'm here talking to you this morning on behalf of the Minnesota Sickle Cell Disease Foundation. I'm so grateful that Ms. Blaylock invited me to talk to you, but that's part of our initiative, is going out to community-based organizations to motivate African Americans to act on their health, not just for blood donation, other issues as well. This is part of the reason why we're providing sickle trait testing for blood donors. The community-based organizations that we're partnering with are a trusted source to overcome some of the historical barriers that I talked about, are a trusted source of information and education, and can provide those opportunities to provide that information for the long term. And they can also make that all important personal ask. It's a familiar face during uncertain times and can provide more convenient venues. It can be the start of us being able to provide more convenient venues for blood drives. And also these organizations are conveners of people who know each other and get people to donate together and be more comfortable with donating. And these are just some of the organizations we're partnering with at the national level. NAACP, we had a meeting with them just about a couple of months ago. Sickle Cell Disease Association of America, the Divine Nine, etc. There are others. Of course, why I'm talking to you this morning is because of our partnership with our local Sickle Cell Disease Foundation. So this is part of it, talking to you like I am this morning. The other thing is we have started a messaging campaign. We, as part of this initiative, one of the things we've done is we've hired dedicated donor recruiters just for this initiative. And we've also put together some messaging with the help of a African-American marketing agency, and also with internal resources within the Red Cross. I'm part of the Black Executive Steering Committee within the Red Cross. All of us have contributed to some of this messaging. And as part of the messaging, we have an intensive focus on the safety of during the COVID pandemic. I am comfortable saying that with all the precautions we put in place, between the sterilization, the social distancing, etc., the frequent cleaning that goes on, and masking, you are probably safer at a Red Cross blood drive than you are going to the grocery store. We are making prominent the fact that we are doing sickle trait testing on our African American donors as a part of a healthcare initiative. People should be aware of their health status. And we're talking to community-based organizations to increase donation sites in the community and provide more convenient times for our communities. And this is just one of the flyers talking about how our blood saves lives as part of our campaign and plays a role in this messaging. The other thing is providing education, like why I'm talking to you this morning. One of the things, and hopefully people better understand, we need all blood donors to provide their ethnicity on when they donate blood. Hopefully you have a better idea for why that is, because again, if you declare that you're African American on the blood donation record. We will then do sickle trait screening. And also, again, it'll make it faster and for us to be able to provide a better match for these patients. And this is not just limited to African Americans. Everybody, as long as you're comfortable, please put down your ethnicity. This applies to everybody. It's such a help for us to find the best match for these chronic transfusion conditions. So please, but also especially for African Americans in this initiative. And we're educating donors about this, but also the need for a more diverse blood supply. So education is a key part of our plan. And finally, I want to finish up with a sickle cell disease patient's success story. This young man, Mr. Blaze Eppinger, is one of our patients that is supplied by Red Cross. He was born with sickle cell disease and as a child needed blood transfusions once a month. Today, he needs blood transfusions 9 or 10 times a year, but during each transfusion, he receives at least 3 units of blood. And that can be a success story because if he's gotten down to only about needing 3 units of blood for a person his size, he's doing pretty well. But again, he still needs them for his entire life. And he says himself in his own words, when I receive the blood donations that I need and my numbers go up, I feel like I'm back to myself. I don't feel the pain. I don't feel drained. It's like putting gas in my car or batteries in my remote. I am energized. And I think he speaks for a lot of patients with this condition. So that's the end of my talk this morning. I ran a little long. I apologize for that. I was only hoping to take 30 minutes of your time. But I do want to give some kudos to this wonderful lady here in this image here. This is Dr. Yvette Miller, my colleague in this and the medical leader of our initiative, our Close the Sickle Cell Gap initiative. And here she is doing her part, donating blood for World Sickle Cell Day earlier this year. And I want to thank her because a lot of the slides I bored you with this morning, not her slides, my slides, were provided to me by my wonderful colleague. So I want to give her her props and kudos for that. And finishing up, how you can help donate blood and encourage others to do so. It's easy. Just go to redcrossblood.org or call us at 1-800-RED-CROSS to set up a donation. Or you can download the Red Cross Blood Donor app, which is really easy. And also that allows you to see who your blood donation went and helped. And I will say this, we are in a crisis mode right now for blood. We are in a shortage that is unprecedented in my over 20 years of doing this line of work. I've not seen a shortage like this. So everybody, please get out and donate. We need blood badly. And of course, we need African-American blood donors for this patient population. So with that, I will hand it over to Ms. Blaylark and field any questions whatsoever. Again, I apologize, Ray, I ran long, but once I get yapping.
Well, that was wonderful. And there were even a few things that I learned, and I've been doing this for a long time. So first and foremost, thank you, Dr. Mair. I want to remind everyone that, yes, we do know that Dr. Mair's screen is sideways, and we could not problem solve that in time to be able to start in a timely manner. So we thank you for bearing with us. We are also thankful that his slides were right side up, so we all don't get a crick in our neck trying to read them. So,
exactly. And I apologize that I'm so technology challenged that.
You know, of all the things that go wrong in the world, you know, I celebrate what goes well and we just roll with it. So again, thank you. I do want to invite people to ask your questions using the Q&A button, not the chat, but there is a Q&A button. One of the questions that I had come in through the chat, and I just want to make sure that I acknowledge it, but it was answered, and that was, do children with sickle cell disease have a better chance at successful bone marrow transplant than adults with sickle cell disease? And my response to that was check out our previous sessions. We have a session with Be the Match, and they talked about some of the differences in transplanting children and adults. And then next week, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to be graced by Dr. Ashish Gupta, who is the pediatric transplant physician at University of Minnesota, and he is going to come and talk to us about those very types of questions. And so I invite the asker of this question to join us next week and to take a look at our previous sessions. Another question that is being asked is, let me pull that back up, is, you talked about simple transfusion versus red blood cell exchanges. And there are different circumstances in which, each of those are used, particularly for individuals who receive multiple transfusions. Can you talk a little bit about how is that determination made when it's time to give a transfusion for someone with sickle cell disease particularly?
Yes, I can touch on that. Well, I'll give you a few scenarios to best answer that question. So let's talk about the patients that are coming in with that acute chest syndrome or a stroke. Those are potentially fatal conditions. So the ideal setting for those individuals, especially in that emergency setting, because those illnesses, those conditions within sickle cell disease can be fatal, would be in my view, would be a red cell exchange, where we're not only just topping off their blood with a simple transfusion with healthy blood, but we're removing the actual abnormal hemoglobin and replacing it with even more healthy hemoglobin. So those are the settings, at least in the emergency setting, where I think, in my view, that those would be an exchange would definitely be the preferential treatment, no question, in my view. For other conditions where simple transfusion might work is sometimes in a pain crisis. Again, if a patient's having a pain crisis and their blood level is not too high, these patients, of course, have sickle cell anemia, meaning their blood count is low, which isn't typically a good thing. Because their blood count's low. When you're anemic, you don't feel as good. But if their blood count is slightly higher, and I won't get into the numbers, then if we just did a simple transfusion, we can actually, even though we're giving them healthy hemoglobin, we can actually increase the thickness of their blood, depending on what their hemoglobin level was to start. So instead of raising their hemoglobin level, total hemoglobin level, both abnormal and normal, with a simple transfusion, sometimes in that setting, if a person is not so anemic, we might want to do a red cell exchange and keep them at the same hemoglobin level, but just simple total hemoglobin level, but replace by percentage-wise more of that with healthy hemoglobin A versus hemoglobin S. Because for some patients, if we get too high, like above well, I won't get into those numbers, but if we get too high, we can actually thicken their blood with just a simple transfusion and possibly cause more harm. And that's where a red cell exchange can also be helpful because we won't raise their level, but get even more healthy hemoglobin into them. So hopefully that wasn't too technical for folks, but those are kind of the things. But for many patients, if they're having a simple pain crisis occasionally now and again, none of these are simple, I don't mean to put it that way, but less complicated, and a simple transfusion can be just fine with 1 or 2 units, just a simple transfusion may be able to provide relief in that setting. The other thing is, well, with simple transfusions, if we use them too much, some of these patients get what's called too much iron in their system, and that can be toxic as well. So.
Sure. So it sounds like the more complicated the crisis or the complication of sickle cell is, that's kind of what helps to determine if they need a simple transfusion or an exchange transfusion in that very moment. And then, but I would also say that what impacts that is the blood supply, right? You know, you talked about the difference, because in a simple transfusion, you only need 1 to 2, typically for an adult, it's a minimum of 2, but units of blood, versus an exchange transfusion, which is actually the removal of all of that person's blood in order to transfuse all new blood. And that requires an entirely different amount of blood, much more. And if there's already not enough on the shelf, and certainly not enough that is the best match for that person, that the decision process is impacted by the supply. Would that be correct?
That is absolutely correct, Ray. I couldn't say it better myself, and I probably didn't. That was perfect. Actually, one of the things, for the first time in my career during the pandemic, because of the drop in blood donations in general, it was the first time in my career that I had to routinely plan on doing just partial exchanges on patients, which aren't ideal. We just did not have the supply to do the complete exchange that we would want to do on these patients. So the pandemic has impacted the blood supply adversely in so many ways, but of course, for this particular patient population, it has even more impact. They need this to live while we're still working on new therapies.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad for that question, because it really reinforces that need to increase. This is why we're doing this talk. It really reinforces that need to increase the diversity of blood donors. We don't want anyone with sickle cell disease to be in a situation where they are not able to get the best treatment because of the lack of blood supply.
Absolutely.
So I have 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. One, the next question is, how often can a person donate blood?
Okay, for your simple blood donation, you can donate about every 56 days for your typical red cell blood donation. So.
Excellent, excellent. And then there are other types of donations, that have different frequency amounts depending on if it's a double red cell donation. Some people are able to donate a double unit of just red cells, which means you're giving those other components back. And they would have you wait a little bit longer just to give your body time to replenish.
Right, it about doubles the time.
Exactly.
That deferral period, since it's a double red cell.
Yes, 112 days, I believe, from my blood banking days.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also platelets, and there's plasma that you can donate, and those are varying times as well.
Right. You can donate platelets like every 2 weeks easily.
Yes, yes. You know, our bodies is really like nature's renewable resource, right? That's the beauty of it. For those of us that can donate, being able to do so regularly, or at least more than you currently are, right, is really of benefit to those who either can't donate or need blood and are the recipients of the different blood products. Okay, we have a question from Dr. Osakomaya and Lagos. And his question is, can you tell me the antibodies of importance which are absent in Black blood that can cause adverse transfusion reactions in people living with sickle cell anemia? That's a really good question.
Yeah, that's a tough one to answer because there are quite a few. But I will say this. Practices vary slightly in medicine because it is a practice in addition to being a science. But I will say that the antigens, so we can prevent the antibodies from forming, that we commonly try to match routinely are the C substance, the big E substance, and the big K substance. So C, E, and K are the 3 big substances that we routinely, generally speaking, try to match for every sickle cell patient. And then once they start forming antibodies, that quickly increases the cells, the substances we're trying to match for. But for your average, it's big C, big E, and big is what we're trying to match. In fact, our initiative internally is called the CEK initiative, so we can provide at least that much of a better match for every sickle cell patient that needs one, to prevent them from forming those antibodies and rejecting future transfusions.
Yeah, it's a complicated effort, and one of the things that I can say, many of you know that I have a son, a young adult son who is living with sickle cell disease, who has had multiple transfusions. I want to give a quick shout out to Memorial Blood Centers. Throughout his pediatric years, he received his care at Children's Minnesota, and they supply the blood supply for Children's, and he has now transitioned into adult care, and so he receives blood at his institution now from Red Cross. So we're blessed to be able to have relationships and get the benefits from both.
Right, and as I talked about in that early slide, community blood centers are also a part of this as well, like Memorial Blood Center.
That's exactly right, and that's what I want to make sure that people recognize, is that as the Sickle Cell Foundation of Minnesota, we recognize that there is a national blood supply, as Dr. Mair said, like beyond what has been seen in the past many years. And so what's important is that you donate, and you may not even be local in Minnesota. So whether you go to your local Red Cross or your local community blood center, it's critically important that you donate. Again, as Dr. Mair said, what we don't want to do is introduce different substances that may come with mismatched or lesser than the best matched blood, because that actually limits options as that person with sickle cell gets older, because their body generates so many more antibodies, and that is life-threatening in so many ways, not just the transfusion reaction of the moment, but then being not having access to the best matched blood because it's simply not available because of how many antibodies you have. So this has been so informative. I'm so grateful for your time and for you walking us through the history of the Red Cross, the history of Dr. Charles Drew and his impact on blood banking. We are actually looking forward to pulling together another presentation with the grandson of Dr. Charles Drew. And so we are looking forward to that, and we will let you all know when that's going to happen. I want to also just do one last share screen so that you all are reminded.
And I apologize for being sideways. Thank you for having me.
No worries, no worries. Again, this is part of our 2021 Living Sickle Smart series with help from our sponsors, Be the Match, Bluebird Bio, and Novartis. It is, there we go. As I said earlier, we are having sessions throughout each month based on topics. You can view these sessions on our website. The best option is to go through our YouTube channel. That's a lot of letters and numbers to try to write down. So if you search for Sickle Cell MN, it should bring us up, or Sickle Cell Foundation of Minnesota. Also, you can keep abreast of our future sessions by subscribing to our Eventbrite channel. Eventbrite is the platform by which we advertise all of our live webinar sessions. Also, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. We are Sickle Cell MN, and you can do so through any of those platforms. Again, you can watch the replay of this session, as I just explained, through all of those channels. And then next week, we hope you'll join us for our curative therapy options in sickle cell disease, Fixing the Bend, with Dr. Ashish Gupta. So next Wednesday at 12:30 p.m., go ahead and sign up for that. We do have a Facebook event page set up for that as well. That'll take you to the registration. And that is it. So thank you again for joining us, everyone. We hope that you learned something new, but more importantly, we hope that you, your friends, your colleagues, loved ones, hey, set up a donor day with all of your friends. There's so many fun things that you can do to make it fun as well. If you've never donated before and you have additional questions or you'd like some guidance, you can feel free to contact us at sicklecellmn@gmail.com. Again, that's sicklecellmn@gmail.com. We'd be happy to walk you through it. We'd be happy to even set up maybe a walkthrough at a donor center so that you can become familiar with the process. As Dr. Mair said, it is incredibly safe, but help us, right? We know
Amen.
that we need us to get through this crisis and so many others. And so our blood does save lives. Your blood saves lives. Thank you so much for looking at ways that you can lean in and participate and make things better for those living with sickle cell disease. Until next time, I'm Ray Blaylark, President and CEO of Sickle Cell Foundation of Minnesota. That is Dr. David Mair of American Red Cross, and we thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I can honestly say this made my week talking to all of you. Thank you for having me. And please, everybody go out and donate, please.
Yes. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.